Welcome to our program, which is called The Story Matters. And our belief is that all of our stories really matter, and we need to give attention to them and work with them. And we have as a partner in our conversation today someone who has done that for a long time, David Weinstock. David is a poet and a writer and a lot of other things, and maybe you'll share that with us, okay. David. I was thinking about the writing. I think you are definitely a very skilled writer and a great wordsmith. And can you talk a little bit about writing a story and getting up and telling the story? What's the difference? What's the dynamic for you that's going on when you, because you do both? Mm-hmm. Okay. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. They are different. They're not as different as they used to be because in general American writers right now tend to go with the colloquial. So we don't use fancy formal language. We don't sound like philosophers, we sound like people. Mm-hmm. So the more informal and casual your writing is, the easier it is to bring it to the stage and talk about it or deliver it. But it's still a very different thing because when you write, you're alone. You're alone in a room. It's you and your computer. And that's a different thing than standing up in front of 12 or 20 or 300 strangers and telling them out loud. One of the ways that it's different is that you're there in your body. You know, as a writer, all that anybody is going to get from you is the words. Not your picture, not a video of you, not the smell of you or the touch of you. They're going to see the words. And it's possible more to separate the words from yourself. Sometimes that's a very creative process. One of the things it lets you do is create characters who aren't you, who talk in their own way rather than your way. But to get up and tell a story in front of people, there are things that help you do that. That's one of the things I wanted to talk about is that if you're making that jump between alone in your study, writing a story, and getting up on a stage and telling the story, if you want to do more than just read the story to them, because they could read it for themselves, then there's a couple of things you could do. There are 3 or 4 things you could do. Number one is to try to forget that there's 300 people in front of you. We are all much more comfortable talking to one person than to 300 people or 50 people or 12 people. So there's a sort of mental trick you can play on yourself, which is to imagine one person that you're talking to. It might be a person who's actually there in the room. It might be a person who in your life is the one you've always told stories to. It could be an imaginary person. It could be a legendary person. But it's easier to talk to one person than to a bunch of people. There's several reasons for that. One is that you know what level to pitch it at. You know what words to use. You know what you have to describe and explain and what you don't have to explain. That's part of it. Another part of it is just that you don't, because writers for the most part are introverts, some more than others, they're not as easily social as some other people. And when they get out in society, they're afraid that they're not going to make the wrong impression, or that they're going to say the wrong thing, or that hundreds of people are going to criticize them afterwards. Those of us who live on the internet feel like if you say something on Facebook or Reddit, that you could have 40 trolls jump on you and tell you you're all wrong and shouldn't have written it and all that. So, and it's very much a case of please all, please none. And one of the reasons that people clam up and can't talk, or even clam up and can't write, is the feeling that you can't please everybody. That's a reason to have one person in your mind that you're talking to. rather than the whole gang. And figuring out who that person is that you talk to, it could be a part of yourself that you talk to. If you're writing, stories for children, you might be thinking of yourself as a child, or you might be thinking of your children. And so that doing that automatically adjusts you to the level of vocabulary, the level of complication, the level of the pace. So nothing's going to make an actor out of you if you're basically a writer, but that's a thing that protects you from the feeling of stage fright and the feeling of, oh my God, I can't do this. Look at these people out here. So that's part of it.
Can you think of a person in particular that has become that focal point for you in some of your writing?
For me, when I write a poem, I guess I'm thinking of certain poets that I like, that I'm hoping would like what I'm writing. I can't name any because it changes depending on what I'm doing.
Sure.
But if I'm telling a story, I guess I hope it's a person a lot like me, and there aren't many people who are a lot like me, so I have to imagine somebody is. So I think I'm talking to my father or my brother or my best friend from college, who we had a wavelength that worked out. But you'll know who you tell your stories to, and that's very helpful when you're trying to tell a story.
If I'm writing or working on something that's zany, then I think of my mother, and I've come to realize how she was a Class A worrier. She could worry better than anybody I know, but I've come to realize when I think back over her last years, what incredible insight she had, in her own crazy way. Is that an example of?
If you can hold her image and her spirit in your mind and speak to her, that's someone you've known all your life, and it's easier to speak to her than to whoever has wandered into the audience. So that would work. Yeah.
Did you know you were a poet before you knew you were a writer, or before you knew you were a storyteller?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that. How did you know that you were a poet, as opposed to an assignment that you have to have? How did you learn that you were the poet, David, the poet?
Well, to some extent, it started with knowing that I wasn't David the athlete, that I wasn't David the investment banker, that I wasn't David the supermodel. That what I had to offer the world, that wasn't what anyone else could do, was poems, and it's a rare thing to want to do, and it's a rare thing to be able to do. And there's just, even among writers, there aren't a whole lot of poets. I mean, there are a lot of poets in the world, but most of the books that get read by people aren't poetry. So poetry is a small slice of things, and so there was something special about that, to be someone telling. And just recently, the last few days, I've been looking through all the poems I've ever written and saying, what do I write about? What are the things that I write about? What are the things I care about? And most of them have a story. When I'm teaching poetry and people read a poem, I say, okay, let's look at this poem and tell what the plot of it is. And they look at me like I'm a little crazy. They didn't know poems have to have plots the way stories and novels do, but they do. Something happens. The plot is that a thing happens and another thing happens and another thing happens, and that's a series of events that's a plot, and that's poems where nothing happens aren't very interesting. So think what I discovered was that I was able to tell poems and have them work and go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't start writing fiction until much later, and I've started to do that. But poems are the main way that I do my writing.
Poetry started where? I mean, what time? When you were really small, did you do, or was it something that came along a little bit later in your life?
For serious, it came freshman year in college.
Right.
I was an English major, and I was studying poetry. I was interested in a lot of poets who were difficult, like Gerard Manley Hopkins,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to do something as cool as that, I guess I'd say.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, I found out that I wasn't going to be a difficult poet. I wanted to be an accessible one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the same way I feel about stories, is that you want to tell a story that people can follow. You want to tell a story people care about. It has to relate to them somehow. And so you look at the things that happen to everybody. Growing up, falling in love, falling out of love, having parents die, having troubles at work, getting fired. There are things that aren't the usual story you would want to tell yourself, but those are the stories that are really interesting. And so it helps to be able to look at your audience and say, let me tell you something interesting that happened to me. Or it doesn't have to be about you, but let me tell you about something interesting that happened to somebody. I'm not sure that answers the question.
No.
Stories are like conversations, only you do most of the talking. We all have an idea of how to make a conversation back and forth with one person or a few people. It's somewhat artificial to get up and tell a story where nobody interrupts, nobody responds, except in their faces or their laughter or whatever. But the thing about telling a story is that it's an unusual thing to do. It's sort of unlike anything else we do. And that's why some people don't feel like they can do it. They don't feel they have permission to do it. When I teach, the main thing that I teach is permission to do writing and storytelling.
What's causing the resistance to be able to, whatever that story happened to you? Or, what's causing that to be a block, do you think?
Well, in your very best stories, you probably do something stupid or wrong. And so it was bad enough to go through it the first time, to go through it again in front of people and say, here's the stupid thing I did and here's what happened. That's one thing. So you're not telling your pride stories. You're not saying, hey, I went to college and I was Phi Beta Kappa and captain of the football team. Isn't that great? No, you don't want to say that. You want to say, here's how I flunked this, or here's how I got kicked off the football team, or because the best stories aren't the happiest stories, and so it's to bring your unhappiness or unhappy things to the story stage is harder. That's one thing about it. Another is the fear of criticism, the fear that somebody will say, that's not the way I remember it, or will say, how dare you say that about your mother, or there's a lot of fear that what happens to the storyteller is what happens in life, which is that people don't agree with you or people tell a different story. So it's a fear of exposure and a fear of criticism. There's also a fear that you won't be entertaining, that you'll be boring. And all of us are boring about something, but you want to know that your audience is going to be interested. They're not going to get up and walk out. They're not going to yawn. They're not going to say, oh, look away and fall asleep.
Yeah.
So you're hoping you'll be able to engage them, or at least engage them enough to listen to you, and to have them hear what you're saying.
You said that when you're writing, you do it alone, but when you're working on a story, do you do that alone as well, or do you need some other people to help you either give correction or give support, or in other words, is framing, creating a story, is that strictly a lone activity, or is that in the process of being engaged with people?
Often the stories you'll find yourself telling in a storytelling situation or on stage are in part the stories you've always told, the stories that happen to you and you remember them. And when people mention, Boston, you say, "Let me tell you what happened to me in Boston." So you'll find that there are stories you've always told, and but in brief, in short. So when you bring them to the stage, you want to give them their context. You want to explain them to people who don't know why you were in Boston. That kind of thing is, in other words, the stories you've always told, the stories that your kids after a while said, yeah, Dad, we've heard that one.
Yeah.
All right. Those are we take your favorite stories and then put them into a form that someone who doesn't know you can understand. That's part of it. Another is to think, what kind of stories do you like?
What kind of stories do you like?
Well, I like stories about people figuring out who they are, or becoming who they are. In the lit world, they call it a Bildungsroman. It's a novel about people becoming themselves or becoming an artist. A portrait of the artist as a young man is sort of the archetype of it, but there's lots of things that are that way. What stories do I like? Well, my wife likes stories about Arctic explorers. And she's read so many stories about Arctic explorers, even the ones who freeze to death in Arctic. We have lots of those books around, and she's always reading books about Arctic explorers.
Yeah.
And I know a few other people who have that specialty. So you'll tend to know. If you read romance books, you like romantic stories. If you read science fiction, you like techie stories, or you like fantastic stories.
So it changes according to the interest, right? In terms of stories that you like, but it's always there as an opportunity to go someplace that you didn't intend to go.
Right.
Do people like to explore with stories, or sometimes I've had this feeling that people get, as you said, people get their stories, their war stories, for example, and that has become encrusted, or that's not the right word. It's all been put in place, so it's told a certain way. Is that an obstacle to storytelling, or how would you help people to deal with that maybe in a slightly more personal way, or to look at it with fresh eyes, instead of just saying, "Well, this is the story," and maybe it's not the story. Maybe there's another story that's underneath that. So how do you help people to to find the story that they really, it's
Well,
really theirs.
Well, war stories is an interesting idea because I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. I'm sure that half of the grown men that I knew had been in the war. And I don't remember any of them ever talking about it. Vietnam was that way too. The first good novels about Vietnam came out many years after that war was over. People don't feel they have the permission to tell the story, especially if the story that they're telling isn't patriotic or isn't heroic. So I think giving people permission to tell the story and to say, look, I want to know what really happened there.
Yeah.
There are things they still aren't going to tell you. If you've ever talked to someone who was in a war, you don't ask, hey, did you ever kill anybody?
Yeah.
They don't want to be asked that. They might have an answer to that, but that's the hardest one. So, you know.
Because it could be a very painful experience to change your story. I mean, because there's a sense in which you get into the story and it becomes the story, and so you repeat it over and over again. But maybe, so it's hard to get beneath that.
So another thing that helps is that just as you might pick out someone to talk to, you can also pick out someone to do the talking. So you can create a character. You can create a person who isn't you. It doesn't have to be, I was in the 1st Artillery and I did this. It was, once there was a soldier, I knew him, I met him once, who did this. So you're creating a character. Creating a character and then having that person tell the parts of the story you can't tell, or tell the parts of the story you can tell, but he could tell them better. He could have, if there maybe 5 things happen on different days, but it's a better story if you have them happen all on the same day. When you're not under oath when you tell a story. I guess that's
okay.
You're not under oath when you tell a story, and you're not always being yourself when you tell the story. And in fact, ideally you aren't.
The question that so often gets asked is that the truth? And the reality is, yeah.
Which is why it's easier to say it's the story.
Right.
Or it's the story he told me, or this is a story I heard. Having that remove that distance between you and who's telling the story helps you tell the story. And even if you are telling a personal experience in the most personal possible way, it's still possible to create a persona who isn't quite you. It's your stage person.
That's probably opening up new possibilities for people. And I'm glad to hear you say it. That doesn't have to be my story. You can tell the story from perspective of somebody else, or some. And in reality, because what happens often with our stories is the I keeps coming in, and pretty soon you're repeating the I did this, I did that, I did that. Whereas if you tell it from the standpoint of someone else, that's a very helpful thing about storytelling, and it might free a number of people up to try new things. You and I participated in a gathering of stories recently called Story Sampler, in which we had 4 stories. We were going to have 5, but we got snowed out in February, and we lost one of our storytellers. And when we came back in March, and there were 4 very different stories. Could you tell a little bit about the difference between the stories and your story?
Well, the first story was the youth librarian here, Tricia, telling Little Red Riding Hood. And she told it pretty much the way it's almost always told. I don't know who wrote it, but she told the story.
Yeah.
But she told it the way you would tell it to a group of 5-year-olds. She got up, she moved around, she made voices, she acted the story. Okay, she acted the story, and that's different than just reading from a podium. She became the characters in the story. You know, when she was Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf was trying to eat her, she became someone who's trying to be eaten by a wolf. So that was the first story, and it was interesting. And I think I was the second, and I had written a story, and I hadn't memorized it. So I read a lot of it, even though it was my story, my personal story, and I if I told it 100 times, I might have been able to do it without looking at the page. But it helped that I had the written part there. But also, it was a story about learning Morse code and using Morse code as a means of communication between me and other ham radio operators, or me and my brother, who was deaf and also a ham radio operator. And so, because the story was related to spelling and words and text, it was less weird for me to be reading it, I think, than if I'd been I'd been just sort of telling a story. The third event, the third story was it was an animation done by an animation class from the college, and it was extraordinary. I don't remember the name of it, but it was a story about a thing that happened in some sort of fairyland with monsters but it was the characters who were speaking were drawn characters, were animated characters. So that's a different kind of storytelling, is to say, not let me tell you a story, but they're going to tell you a story, or they're going to act out a story. And the last story, again, was a personal reminiscence of someone who was talking about how it was that she had created the local group here that sings to people who are in hospice. And her story was very beautiful in that she was dealing with her mother dying, and she sort of really didn't know what to do with her, and somehow it came in her head to sing a hymn. And that worked so well that she did another one, and pretty soon singing to the dying became something she really understood, and that had worked better than anything she'd heard of. You know, she didn't want to make conversation. She wanted to sing, whether that person was listening or not listening, conscious or unconscious. It was a personal story in that it was something that that had really happened to her, and she told it, I think, pretty straight. Did she improve on it? I don't know, but she told a good story.
I thought it was an amazing thing that there was that diversity in stories, but yet there was a thread that connected. At least this was what people said afterwards, who were experiencing this moment. And so to me, it's very encouraging to say that there is no one story, no one style, no one pattern, no one way in which you engage in storytelling, or story shaping, or story writing. But and so we're looking for others. We're looking for others, and part of what prompted this was Middlebury Community Television, is mindful of that our task is to help put the images out for people to see, and for the stories to be told. And that today you can make a little movie with your camera. And so kind of an image that developed was, okay, maybe we'll have a show in which there's 3 or 4 or 5 images, stories that are told, and they're just there for people to look at, and then they don't become typecast. So that's just helping us think this thing through in terms of other stories. I thought your story with your brother, first time you did tell a little bit of that story in one place. It did focus on you as a teenager and not in sports, but I was just really really touched by the way you talked about your brother, and I just wanted to I had a chance to say thank you for that. Now we've kind of gone around on storytelling. Are there things that we would like to say to people? Because we're trying to encourage folks to tell their story and to learn how to do that. So are there other pieces of advice or insights or?
I think that the thing to remember is that you have a story and no one else is going to be able to tell it as well as you. You were there for every second of your life and you know that story. Whether you've yet found the permission to say it or the way to say it, that might take a while. But the point is that you're the one to tell the story. And that's the story that's the best story you can tell, is the story that nobody else knows and that nobody else can tell. And that's worth doing, and worth learning how to do if it doesn't come naturally.
That is a marvelous summation, really, of kind of our hope and ambition and desire. So we thank you, David.
Thank you
for talking today about this, and we hope that people will continue to think about their story and tell it, and that we will be able to come across their path as we gather storytellers and stories together. And so we engage you, we invite you, we encourage you. Be a storyteller.